seminar presented by the MedTech Talent Accelerator. We're honored to have with us our speaker, Richard Roy, Vice President of Product Development and Scale-Up at Applied Pharmaceutical Innovation, who today will present his talk called Medical Devices, a Transition Story from Engineering to Quality and Regulatory. Before we start, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. Richard, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Thank you to the MedTech Talent Accelerator team as well, and the University of Calgary. Today, I just want to go through kind of a little bit about my career progression, hopefully giving you some information about the med technology industry and just how I did my path in this area over the years. Yeah, as was said earlier, my presentation is titled Medical Devices, a Transition Story from Engineering to Quality and Regulatory. So just a little bit about the organization that I'm currently at. We are called Applied Pharmaceutical Innovations. What we try to do is facilitate world-class innovation in pharmaceuticals, but beyond that, we actually do support medical devices, in vitro diagnostics, natural health products, and beyond in the other areas around, for example, controlled substances and whatnot. So we're actually more diversified than even what this slide gives. And really what our purpose is to support innovators, small, medium enterprises, and even beyond in their, what I'll call the product development journey, and utilizing the knowledge that we've developed over the years in industry to help them in that journey. And that's kind of, what we'll discuss a little bit today in my own journey, which has helped lead to me to get to this role and to be able to support innovators in the industry. So just a little bit about myself. You probably saw the little bio, but just to go over, I do have a chemical engineering degree from McGill University and a master's in biotechnology from the University of Toronto. And I've spent the last 20 years in the life sciences sector, working on all those different products I was mentioning earlier, with a focus on product development, quality, and regulatory. So just to show you kind of my progression, and this is kind of more of a summary slide, and I'll go into more details in the actual slides following. But I started my career really just out of the engineering side, working as a validation specialist and an engineering project specialist for companies like Aventis Pasteur, which is vaccines, and Merck Genpharm, which is on the generic side, in small molecule manufacturing, pharmaceuticals. And so, at that time, my focus was really on facility and equipment, given my background. But then I pivoted to I'll use the term quality systems. I'll talk a little bit about what quality systems mean in a later slide, but it was kind of something intriguing about this industry with the regulations and the quality systems that are set up in order to meet those regulations. So I became fascinated by that and I actually made the pivot to the quality side of the industry, becoming the quality systems manager for a company out in Alberta that was getting into both the medical device space and the pharma space. Through the years of experience, I did develop my kind of expertise in the quality and regulatory side. And then given my technical background, I kind of was a natural kind of fit for the product development aspect as well. So I ended up becoming the head of quality, regulatory, and product development, what I call kind of three critical areas of the organization in the medical device space and pharma space. Just because, the processes and the deliverables, from the regulatory perspective, they were so interrelated and it was really a natural fit. And then later in my career, as I've seen the success of my organizations, I did decide to go into a consulting role. And the consulting role is basically taking all the information that I accumulated over the years of experience in the industry and seeing all the successful launches, seeing, patients using our products in hospitals, seeing patients, have conditions treated by our products and that kind of thing. It was, I decided I want to do that in a consulting capacity. So I made the switch to consulting. So today I want to talk about three what I call main themes of this progression. And I wanted to kind of give this a kind of high level notes about what you can think about as you get into the medical technology sector. The first one was a process-based approach. So basically because I took chemical engineering, which is very process-based engineering, and then with a focus on biotechnology, a lot of time was spent on these processes, whether in petrochemical or in healthcare or in agriculture, we're looking at the science and the processes behind that as you look at the design and manufacture of those products, which is very intriguing. So I always kind of learn from there this process mindset. And then to add to that is another concept of risk-based approach. A risk-based approach, I mean, risk is inherent everywhere, as we know. It's in our everyday life, right? But within the medical device sector, it is also very pertinent. For example, when you're designing a medical device, risk is absolutely part of that process. And there's tools out there such as the failure modes and effects analysis, where you use these tools to determine the risks related to the design of your product and ensure you deal with those, you mitigate those risks so that you get the safety and, of course, the effectiveness of your device corresponding to the intended use. So it's a very important tool. And then beyond that, as you look at risk, when products on the market, then you're looking at what I'll call post-market work with things like customer complaints or potentially an adverse event. Those are important when you're looking at the risk of those complaints and what you need to do because of those. And then there's also, risk tools utilized in things like vendor management, which is a key quality system where you're looking at, what level of control or scrutiny do you have to have on a manufacturer of, say, the most important thing that goes in your product versus someone that's doing, much less risk work for your organization. So your vendor management is also based off of a risk approach. Specifically, there is an ISO standard 14971 that talks about this application risk management in medical devices. So it's definitely worth a look at that standard. The third part I would say would be the appreciation for the regulations. Medical devices, in vitro diagnostics, it's a highly regulated industry, and that's for a reason. Obviously, what we're doing with these products, with diagnosis or treatment of patients is very important that we make sure we get it right. So, once I started in the healthcare industry, working for some of these multinationals I did, that the GXPs or the GMPs, were really at the forefront. And, I really took, I noticed how important they were and really took, it resonated with me, right? So that's really where I kept developing my kind of understanding and skills in the GMP area as well. So all three of these, the process-based, the risk-based, and the appreciation for the regulations, I say were key to the progression of my career. So first I was talking about the facility and production equipment. That was kind of when I was talking about, early in my career when I was dealing with engineering. Because, you don't know where you're going to end up in this industry, it's important to kind of go over some of those and what, what's involved in, for example, facility design and qualification. When you're setting up a facility to manufacture a medical device or a drug or a natural health product, there's a lot of considerations that need to go into that, which includes, questions like which room will be used for what stage of the production process. Like, is it a warehouse? Is it a production room? Is it an incoming material area? What the material and personnel flows will look like. So, for example, it's not just, we have the equipment. It's like, well, what does the process look like? Where are people going to come into these areas and be able to do their jobs and make a safe and effective product? And then any regulatory requirements around room classifications. One term you'll hear, is what class is your room? And you'll hear, like a standard like ISO 14644, which talks about the different classifications for rooms, and that's based off of cleanliness requirements, particles in the air and stuff like that. And then cleaning requirements, like things like what the wall and floor is made of to ensure that you can do adequate cleaning, so that you make sure your environment is safe for the production of that equipment. And then going into equipment selection and validation, this is more specific to the production equipment and not necessarily the medical technology you're manufacturing. You're looking at what is the equipment being used for? Are there any specific quality or technical requirements that equipment needs to meet? And are there any kind of input or output, considerations? Like, for example, line speed. If you're doing a high throughput product, you of course want to know, how many are you going to be able to make, and are you going to be able to meet market demand, as an example. So how do these all connect back to this quality regulatory world I was talking about? So these all lead to like what I'll call key documents in the industry. Like you'll hear terms like user requirement specifications, which lead to a functional specification, which leads to a design specification. These terms resonate in the industry because they're so important to set these properly and have them go from the URS, the FS, and the DS in the order that makes sense, because that's how you're going to ensure your design is correct. So once you've got your design in place and you're looking at your facility, you're looking at your equipment, then you're looking at terms like the factory acceptance tests or site acceptance tests when it actually comes to your manufacturing site. You'll hear terms like installation qualification, operational qualification, and performance qualification, IQ, OQ, PQ for short, that you'll hear in the industry. And again, those are ensuring that the facility is qualified and the equipment is validated for its purpose. And this all leads to what I call the end goal of process validation, which is that your production process and your facility is adequate for the medical device that you're manufacturing. So as I mentioned, that was early in my career where I was in the engineering side. So this kind of is where I transitioned. I fortunately got the opportunity to join a company out in Alberta that was supporting a company that was growing in medical devices and pharmaceuticals. So it was kind of a bringing both quality systems into the story, the GMPs from the pharmaceuticals as well as the quality systems from the medical device perspective, which was quite interesting and it was very exciting. So just to tell you a little bit about what those quality systems are as they related to the medical device side of it. Here are some of these high-level ones. You may have seen these before, you may have not, but it's important to understand kind of which of these standards are in place to make sure that the products we're making fulfill regulatory requirements and lead to safe and effective medical devices. So the key one you probably heard is ISO 13485-2016. Again, this looks at the quality management system. It's an international standard. A lot of countries recognize this, including Canada. So it's a very important and when you're looking, I'll go into a little bit more specifics of what it involves, but it's a very important standard. The US has their own 21 CFR Part 820 quality system regulations. There is a lot of overlap and similarities between the two, but they do have their own system under the Code of Federal Regulations. And then, more specifically, Health Canada has also introduced the Canadian medical device regulations that have been around for a while, actually, which goes a little bit more specific than ISO 1345 into the specific Canadian requirements. There is a term you'll hear in the industry called Medical Device Single Audit Program. This program was introduced not that long ago, and it's basically an organization that is looking at making these audits by registrars more efficient by covering more than one jurisdiction during an ISO audit, like a certification audit for ISO 1345 as an example. And the countries that are participating in this program are countries like Australia, Brazil, Canada, Japan, and the US FDA. So as I mentioned, I just want to expand a little bit. I'm not going to go into all these in detail, but I wanted to kind of show you kind of high level, what does a quality management system involve, right? So if you look at the ISO standard or the QSR in the US, these are the main kind of points. The quality management system, which deals with control of documents and control of records, having SOPs, work instructions, and forms to do what you document what you do type of mentality. Management responsibility, another key point where it looks at management commitment to the organization to ensuring a quality culture and making sure that compliance is there and people, staff know what their role is to achieve this compliance as an organization. Resource management that looks at the training of staff and job descriptions that identify what the staff member is responsible for, which links directly to what training they'll need to have to be able to do their jobs properly. Infrastructure and facilities to make sure again, talking about what I earlier on about the facility equipment, making sure that the infrastructure is there to be able to manufacture that product. Then the product realization itself. This is where you're actually designing and making the product. So again, I mentioned design control earlier. It's so important that your design control process is done properly, and then change control. So if there are any post changes that are done to your design, there is a control process to make sure that the product or medical device is brought back into compliance with after those changes are made. Another important aspect is purchasing, where you're buying supplies, you're buying equipment. There's a bunch of different things you could be purchasing as your business grows and as you manufacture product, and that really falls under what I call the category of vendor management, which again is to me a very critical aspect of a medical technology company. Production and service provision and validation of processes. When you look at the term I mentioned earlier was process validation. It's so important that you have defined your manufacturing process and you've validated all the steps involved to make sure you have reproducibility, that your product that you're producing is going to be, meeting the safety and efficacy or effectiveness of that product that you're making. And then the last one on the product realization, and again, these are highlights of the standard, not the exhaustive list of everything within the QMS, but the control of monitoring and measuring devices. So having your equipment program, making sure your equipment is calibrated, making sure it's maintained, obviously making sure it's functioning properly. Then the other area within the standard is the measurement, analysis, and improvement. This one looks at, as your manufacturing product, what are you doing to, kind of monitor its quality? So that's a control of non-conforming products. And then once it's on the market, that's complaint handling or good vigilance practices, they call it, when it's basically, what happens when it's on the market and you get a complaint or something goes wrong in the field, what needs to be done and what needs to be reported to the regulatory authorities. So if you're launching the product in Canada, there's an issue somewhere in Canada, there's expectations that you report it depending on the severity of the issue. And then internal audit, which I'll go a little bit more into internal audits later on, but it's an important tool that we have. And then corrective actions and preventive action, a term you may have heard, or CAPA for short. And again, this is a very powerful tool that you use to address an issue, but also to continuously improve your organization. So one area I did want to specifically talk about as you look at your journey into this medical technology field and developing medical products is this design development part of that quality system I was just mentioning. I'll go over briefly just some of the main sections of this, and really the importance of this is because you look at the process that goes involved in design control. Really, I have on the left, it's the ISO kind of 7.3 standard, but then there's also the equivalent of the Part 820 standard, which talks about planning. So that's why you see the kind of the slash in the middle. They just describe it slightly differently between the regulations. But it's important, as you go through, you have your design development planning, where you're developing a product, you're defining responsibilities, you're defining your plan on how you're going to get to that end goal. You're establishing your design inputs. What is your medical product going to do? What is its intended use? Design outputs, looking at what is that evaluation going to look like to make sure that it's going to be doing what you need it to do by establishing things like acceptance criteria. The design review process. The design review process is critical to have during the stages of your product development, so that that you are fulfilling, as you go along. There's going to be iterations, there's going to be failures, and you're going to continue those reviews and ensure you're building off of that to make an effective product. Design verification is ensuring that you met, and manufactured the product to meet those design requirements. And then the next one is design validation. So it's a little bit different of a term than verification, in that you want to make sure now you've made it properly. Does it do what it's supposed to do? And that's more kind of when you're getting more on the clinical side, where you're kind of saying, well, did this medical product do what it's supposed to do? And that's in your validation aspect of your design control process. Design transfer, you're taking all this information and you're now transferring it to, how it's going to be manufactured, right? So a key deliverable of that process is what we call production specifications. How are they going to know, what needs to be made, how it needs to be made, what you need to control, and what needs to be tested to ensure it was made properly on the manufacturing scale. And then, as I mentioned earlier, change control, or design changes. It's important that when you do make changes, that they go through the process appropriately, and verification takes place as changes are made, whether before launch or after the product has been launched. And then all this is built into what we call the design history file. It forms part of your package, regulatory package, which I'll talk about later on, but it's an important aspect of a medical device development process. So one of the terms I mentioned earlier was a risk-based approach. I'm going to talk to you a little bit, high level on, what that means in terms of the regulations. So, how the regulatory bodies, I mentioned Health Canada, US FDA, European, different notified bodies there, how they talk about risk in terms of the medical device itself is based off of a risk classification system as shown here. Canada has a class 1 to 4, United States has 1 to 3, and then Europe has their system with the 2A, 2B as well. Now you'll see the arrows on the right, and so basically as the risk goes up, so class 1 being low risk, that's what this shows. And then based on that, and of course, the requirements also go up as the risk of the medical device goes up. And when I say risk, I mean, what is the medical device being used for? What's the indication? What's the treatment? What is it trying to diagnose? And that's how they kind of determine risk. The other thing is, are there other products on the market already doing it? Is yours a novel invention? Is there not a lot of clinical data out there on it? And that also plays into, kind of this risk determination. So, once you know kind of the category of your product, the risk classification of your product, then you have to go into your regulatory filing to get the product approved. So this is a very important aspect of our industry, is that in order for a medical device to be sold into a jurisdiction, it will need a regulatory approval. And this approval process is different, in different jurisdictions. For example, in Canada, we have something called the Health Canada Medical Device License. So medical devices in Canada are approved through a medical device license application. Now, these license applications are required for medical devices that are in risk categories 2 to 4. Now, the intensity of these applications, like in terms of what the information you have to provide to Health Canada, does kind of go up as the risk goes up. So obviously a class 4 risk would be a lot more information than a class 2 in terms of what the Health Canada would need to see in order to approve the product and issue the license. In the US, they have a process called the 510K or the PMA. The PMA is a pre-market approval. And the reason, they have two is because one of them is, again, it's based on risk. It's based on what's already known out there. So they have a term called predicate device. The predicate device is basically, if somebody already out there has somebody doing something similar and they've already got approval for the FDA, then they've already gone through that vigor. So you can actually reference it and say, well, the predicate device did this, ours does this, and that helps the FDA in their approval process. PMA is more work because it is more novel. And, there's a question that comes up, for example, do you need to have clinical studies? And what kind of clinical information do you need to provide in order to get regulatory approval? But when I go into a regulatory submission, I do like to think of it as a process. So, I look at what forms need to be completed and, what will need to be included in the package that's sent to the regulatory body. What technical information does the product need to meet? So the FDA or Health Canada knows how the product is supposed to work and what its intended use is. Are there any technical standards out there? So, for example, you'll hear terms like ASTM, AMI, ISO, etc., that already exist that may be applicable to the product you're working on. Or you could be defining it if it is novel, yourself, and kind of looking at what's out there and kind of developing that specification, those acceptance criteria I mentioned earlier, part of your design control process. And then the last one is, what testing data is necessary to present to the regulator. As I mentioned earlier, is it analytical testing? Is it what they call AQL testing, acceptable quality level, or is it something like an actual clinical study that needs to be done based off the risk of the product? And this all kind of gets pulled together into the DHF, as I defined earlier, and plays a huge role in your regulatory filing. Just to give an example, so I've talked a little bit about my progression. So I want to talk about one example of where I have done this and was successful with the FDA as an example. So this is an example of a regulatory submission I did several years ago in 2016 for a surgical isolation gown, level 3, AMI PP70 level 3. So the PP70 is basically the standard that it was fulfilling. Level 3 was the level of basically performance, which links to the safety. So the reason why that's important is, healthcare practitioners, they use the product based off of risk, right? So if they're in a high risk situation where they need an isolation gown like a level 3, level 4, that's what they're looking for. They're not going to use an open back gown. They're going to use a full isolation gown like this. So level 3 gowns, are high risk gowns, and therefore the FDA required a 510K. And so we went through the process of the 510K submission. A couple of key points from this is you look at a couple of terms you'll see on there called classification product code. So the FDA and Health Canada, they give these these 3-letter codes. If you can see it on there's FYC. Why is that important? Well, what they try to do is they try to group these products in together so that it helps in the regulatory approval process, so they understand kind of where these products fall and the associated requirements for those products. So on the slide, on the part on the right, you'll see something called recognized consensus standards, right? Those are in place so that if the FDA has already identified what needs to be tested and what data you're going to need to show in order to get approval. So for example, ASTM F1670 or ASTM F2407. So in some cases, those are already available, which is great because it helps guide you in that process of generating the data for regulatory approval. And in other cases, like a PMA, a lot of that you're going to be determining yourself with your technical team and working with the regulator to ensure you have adequate data. So another aspect, once the product is on the market, and I mentioned the term internal audits earlier, but I want to go a little bit broader with the concept of quality audits. I'm sure you've probably heard of the term audit before. In the medical device field, it does play a huge role as well. There are what I call 3 major types of audits that do take place. The first one is what I call an internal quality audit to ensure internal processes are functioning as intended. And any of the records that it generates. So as you probably heard earlier, I mentioned the term forms. So forms are generated to show evidence of what you did. It's a record, right? So as your quality system happens and you're running through these processes, you're generating these forms as evidence. Now, what are they used for? They could be used for the submission, but they could be also used for something I'm going to get to later on, which is the third-party audit, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's very important to keep those records and maintain them as per the document retention policies. Internal audits should foster, and this is my own kind of guidance on this, they should foster a culture of continuous improvement and not quality department policing the other areas of the organization. I truly believe this is true in the sense that we should be working together. As you might have findings, but that's fine. Let's work together on determining how to improve those, how to make the organization better, whether within the QMS or the design of the product. So it's a very valuable tool, audits and the subsequent corrective action, preventive action, which I mentioned before, if it does come out of that process. The other concept is vendor audits. So as I mentioned before, about the vendor management program, it's important that companies identify the key vendors and implement the right level of control of those vendors, because of course, those vendors do play a role in the safety and effectiveness of the medical product that you're going to be manufacturing, right? So it's very important to have a well-established risk-based vendor management program. So vendor audits can and will be part of that, where you actually go to the different, depending on the type of vendor, and actually audit their factory as an example, and walk through their processes, whether it's how they manufacture the component that's going into your product, or their quality systems and how they're working. Make sure those are robust and working properly, ensuring the right records, because you never know in the event of, for example, a problem with the product in the field, that you might have to go back and investigate why it happened, and it may go back to one of your key vendors. And then the last one is around third-party audits, where you will get audited as a medical device company. You will get audited, whether it's an ISO audit, getting your registration to ISO 13485, whether it's a regulatory body like the FDA or Health Canada doing an actual regulatory inspection. I've been through 3 FDA inspections myself and many Health Canada inspections over my years in the industry. Obviously it takes a lot of preparation, but a lot of that quality culture does help in the preparation to be ready for those inspections. And then clients. So depending on your business model, you may have clients that you're working with, a co-brand, a private label, a licensing deal. You might be a contract manufacturer for them. It depends on what you're doing. And so they will come and audit you. And they may have a robust audit program, or maybe a small enterprise that's really just interested in seeing what you're doing. But you should be ready for either case when you're in this industry. The success of these audits is a reflection of the quality of the processes put in place, of course, appropriate to what you're doing and the product that you have. But it's also, making sure that you have established the quality culture in your organization, because, it's really important that it's not just quality doing quality. The whole organization has that quality culture. The one thing I will mention, if you do have a failure doing, for example, a regulatory audit, that can lead to very negative consequences on the organization. A lot of times these outcomes of an audit is publicly available. So if you get a non-compliant rating from, say, Health Canada, that will be publicly available, and people will be able to see that you got a non-compliant rating. So it's very important to ensure you achieve that compliant rating. Yeah, you might have a finding you might need to address. That does happen, like a 43. But as long as it's not impacting safety and effectiveness of your product, and you're able to address that with the regulator, you're usually not going to run into any issues. Worst case scenarios, you've heard of the term recalls or a consent decree, where you have to make an agreement with the regulator to ensure you're going to do this and do this moving forward, or else you have to stop making the product, as an example. So some key quotes from ISO 13485, and I thought these were pretty important quotes. I just wanted to mention them. So the monitoring and measurement of processes, and the process again is a nice theme of this talk. The organization shall apply suitable methods for monitoring and as appropriate measurement of the quality management system processes. These methods shall determine or demonstrate the ability of the processes to achieve planned results. When planned results are not achieved, correction and corrective actions shall be taken as appropriate. So again, going back to the importance of processes. And then subsequent to that, the product itself. The organization shall monitor and measure the characteristics of the product to verify that product requirements have been met. This should be carried out at applicable stages of the product realization process in accordance with the planned and documented arrangements and documented procedures. So again, those key things I was talking about within the quality system, they connect directly to these 2 sections, the monitoring and measurement of processes and product. And obviously, if you're fulfilling these, then you're doing your job within this highly regulated industry of medical devices and medical technology. So I just want to leave with a kind of high-level note here. Within the medtech space, there are a lot of roles to be filled. Hopefully, today's presentation, which focus on process, risk, and the regulations, help provide some valuable information to you as you start your journey or continue your journey in the medical technology sector. So I just want to thank you very much for your time today. My email is there if you would like to contact me after this session.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. So now we'll open it for a question and answer period. The audience, please feel free to write your questions in the chat, or you can open your microphone and just ask a question directly. Okay, until anyone writes something, we did have some questions that came in during the registration for this seminar. So let's start with the first one. So about the medtech market in Canada, is it primarily commercial R&D, or is there R&D that happens at the national or academic levels?
Okay, well, good question. I mean, I think when I work with medical technology innovators, it's looking at a couple aspects, like what is the innovation, what are they trying to do with it? Is there a market need for it? Is there a large need for things? I'll give an example of, for example, like an in vitro diagnostic. So one of the things we learned with the pandemic was that we needed to be ready for something like this, right? And so what I've seen more recently is a lot of these researchers and innovators, whether university affiliated or small and medium enterprises, they are looking at potential, areas to target moving forward now that we've learned what we've learned during the pandemic. So, there's federal kind of incentive for us to, as a country in Canada to, build these medical technologies to be ready